Hello, everyone. So I'm really grateful for Corinna Lotz and Kyrill Potapov to come and talk about Ilyenkov. They are organizers of the International Friends of Ilyenkov, and I'm personally extremely interested in that because in the Museum of Care, we started to try to develop the connection between David and Spinoza in our reading group of about David Graeber and his philosophers. And then me and David, we were talking a lot about Vygotsky. So now Ilyenkov is like naturally come to the picture. And yeah, thank you so much for coming. And I'm giving space to you.
All right, I'm just going to display this and then hold on.
Slideshow, Kyrill. Yeah.
Go ahead, Corinna.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Nika and Mark, for making connection with us, and we're really really excited to be together with you and all of your friends and our friends. Okay. Well, what we're going to talk about is what is personality, which is Ilyenkov's essay, which probably quite a few have read, and Kyrill made this picture out of ChatGPT. It's a computer-generated picture of Ilyenkov.
It is a neural net, but not ChatGPT. Yeah.
And this is just a little summary of who Ilyenkov was. He was born just nearly 100 years ago in Smolensk, which is in Russia. And he was a Russian philosopher, and he opposed in his work the crude versions of Marxism that were very dominant in the period that he lived in, which obviously was post-World War II. And he, well, during and post, I should say. And as I think you might have already gathered from the introductions, he brought together in his work many strands, but predominantly the three that I've outlined on the screen. Spinoza, who was a Dutch Jewish thinker who lived in the 17th century, in the period when Holland was very much developing dramatically as a major power. And it was in his time, it was very liberal. In Amsterdam was probably the most liberal place in Europe at that time in terms of freedom of thought. Ilyenkov is a passionate devotee of Hegel, who was amongst the German classical idealists, the most outstanding figure, who himself was very much inspired by the French Revolution of 1789. And then Ilyenkov brought these together with the work of Marx and Engels, who, as you no doubt know, were analysts of capitalism and from a materialist dialectical standpoint, and they were activists throughout their entire lives in developing revolutionary concepts and revolutionary organizations. So this is just a little pictorial summary of Ilyenkov, who he was, and that's a photograph of him when he was in the Soviet armed forces. And just, well, that was a new edition of the dialect. It should actually, I think, be the dialectics of the ideal, but it's his very important contribution to the development of philosophy, which is really in the title. It's both dialectical and examining what is the ideal. And his concept of dialectical logic, in the sense that it came from the Spinozan point of view, was the understanding that he's had that, and the idea he tried to develop was that nature performs through us as human beings. That was his phrase. And his concept of the ideal was that it was a collective human imaginary, but that is not only in, it's not in the individual mind, but it exists as a real thing in social reality. So, and just to finish, he committed suicide in 1979. Do carry on. This, okay, well, this is developing Ilyenkov's idea that we get to know each other through others. And in these portraits here, you can see on the left is a pastel drawing by Degas of Van Gogh. The one in the dark one on the left is by an Australian painter, another portrait of Van Gogh. And the one on the right, next one along, is Van Gogh by himself, it painted in the same year. And on the far right is Van Gogh with the famous bandage, which was when he tried to cut his ear off in an anguished reaction to his relationship with Gauguin. What we're trying to show with these is that on the two left portraits, which are not self-portraits, show him very confident and quite distinguished and with a powerful sense of his own presence, whereas the ones that he did of himself, he looks rather more, you could say, more unhappy and disturbed. So others saw him really as a confident artist, whereas he saw himself very often in a very questioning and unstable, disturbed way. And this is just a little fun thing to working on Ilyenkov's phrase. Ilyenkov says in the essay that if you're looking for personality, you won't find it. You won't find it by, if you're looking for the essence of that sculpture, which is the Nike of Samothrace by a Greek sculptor, if you're looking for the essence of it, you will not find it by chipping off a bit of the marble. Nor would you find somebody's personality by cutting open the head and looking inside the brain. And I put the Nike swoosh because it's interesting how the Nike logo is tried to express the essence of that sculpture in a modern way. But where is the personality? Actually, I skipped a bit there, Kyrill. If you go back. You could go back to, yes, to that. Ilyenkov quotes Oscar Wilde on this question. He says, Oscar Wilde said, "It is only shallow people who do not judge by appearances." And the deep truth of this paradox by Oscar Wilde is that artists can grasp the essence of personalities by penetrating through the appearances, through the surface appearance, and through that bringing out the essence of a personality. So they can see things that others can't see. So,
yeah, I was a while ago on like an internet date, and we were talking about personality, and she was saying to me that for her it's pretty obvious what personality is. It's the core that you have inside of yourself, that's the unchanging part. There's all of these changing bits which are like the masks on top of your personality. You've got this inner core which is unchanging, and you know about it by reflecting on yourself through introspection. And she was kind of felt very defensive when I said, okay, but if you were born in a different time or a different place, don't you think you'd have a different personality? And her feeling was like, well, no, because what I mean by personality is it's this just feeling of myself that I have, and no one else can get at that. So it's irrelevant. Things like where I was born, that's not that. It is like a kind of unchanging soul, and there's this kind of mystical view that the personality is this just ineffable, unchanging core. That's one view. Back to you, Corinna.
Yeah, and the second common view, which I asked a friend of mine who's actually an artist herself and a very sophisticated and insightful person. I said, what do you think personality is? And she immediately said, oh, it's our genes. And I thought that was quite significant, because obviously it is a widespread view, and it's the one that Ilyenkov really struggled against, reducing the person to their genes, and that in that sense it becomes you're predetermined by your genes, and you could say that what these two views have in common is that both of them tend to make the personality something that's permanent and unchanging and there from the very beginning.
Yeah, and they both chip off a part of the sculpture, as we saw in Corinna's example there. So either here's this inner core within all the other acting out stuff, or you chip off something like neuroticism as a innate trait that everyone has. There are lots of theories that Ilyenkov does go through, but another one to highlight is the existentialist view. So in his characterization, for existentialist philosophers like Sartre, you've kind of got society, which is this reductive force that's outside of ourselves and sort of pressing down on us, and we have these kind of universal norms or stereotypes that are forcing us into acting in particular ways, being in particular ways, and then the individual resists that and expresses their own freedom, and that's where you have creativity and novelty through the individual kind of acting in ways that go against that. Well, Ilyenkov says it's exactly the opposite. The social plane, the world, it's not this flat plane. It's actually this dynamic landscape of all kinds of potentialities, and an expression of personality that's actually where you lock down the potentialities into a particular that in some ways is still. So what you're actually doing in every expression of personality is you're taking all of this multiplicity of the world as a whole, and you're putting it into the kind of in the form of the individual, and that's what we'll come back to again later. Implicitly, what Ilyenkov is talking about a lot in this essay is Hegel's view of personality, which was most famously picked up by Sartre, and also, Sartre got it from Kojev, but just at the simplest level is this idea that if someone is a master with a slave, well, actually the master relies on the slave to recognize him as a master and to treat him as a master in order to be a master. And in the same way, the slave is a slave because he's being treated as a slave by the master. So it's this sense in which we recognize each other, and then actually we recognize ourselves through someone else. So it's not introspection. We recognize ourselves through other people and how other people relate to us. But Sartre has this sense where he sees it as a kind of imprisoning thing, and you can see that because actually, even contemporary philosophers, lots of people read Hegel like this. That what's going on here is a kind of internal struggle. So, for example, for analytic philosopher John McDowell, we within ourselves have this constant struggle where we're sort of like, well, I'm not really who other people say I am. I'm just myself. And then you're like, okay, but who am I? Well, this person says that I'm this. So this constant kind of inner struggle of taking in someone else's perspective and saying, no, it's our perspective, and then it's my perspective, and it's in Hegel's term, it's like this battle to the death almost, where we constantly trying to assert who we are. But what you've got here is a dyad. You've got this kind of like back and forth struggle, and Ilyenkov wants to just only take this as a starting point and actually to invert that as well. So to actually escape from this sort of prison or hell, Sartre famously saying hell is other people, because you've got this kind of structure, through emphasis on the fact that there's a third, there's a social world in which we are relating to each other through activities, through objects, and yeah, to model this in a Vygotskian way, you've got me in a relation to another mediated by tools and activities. So when I go to the supermarket, or if I am a cashier in the supermarket, it's not just my relation to the cashier that or the cashier's relation to me that makes her feel like a cashier. It's also our relation to the people behind me in the queue and the other cashiers. And what's more, it's that she's the one sitting behind the till. So there's all of these physical objects that we think of as just like part of the environment that are actually structuring our personality. And what's interesting here is you get a sense of different cashiers having different personalities, almost in things like the way that they scan your items through the till, the things that they ask you, like are they making small talk while they're doing that. So it's in this activity that it's expressed. And yeah, Corinna pointed out to me earlier that it's interesting that now that cashiers are being replaced by self-service checkouts, you get the kind of alienation is even wider, and there's even less kind of abilities for people to feel any kind of expression of their personality doing this kind of job, where they just running. They have to run up to you when your item wasn't scanned properly, or they need to confirm your age. It kind of destroys this kind of relationship. So yeah, it's not a dyad, because we're at the same time being affected by all of our relations, often in complex ways, and often at the same time from lots of directions. And because yeah, a lot of this it's a physical environment. It's not like in Sartre, like norms floating up here, not being affected through our own activity. It just is in the activity.
This drawing, which mystified Kyrill, I think, is meant to be putting into motion what Kirill's just explained, where we have the red blob in the middle with a black center represents the individual personality, and which lives within this ensemble of social relations, which is Marx's expression. Marx called it unity in multiplicity, because we exist in this complex of relations. But that complex, or that ensemble, is obviously part of the entire infinite world and relates to it constantly in different ways. And I've done it as a spiral because I'm trying to represent, this is like the child that is growing up within its family, within the wider social world that it exists in. And then the arrows, what the arrows show is this interaction, constant interaction out from inner to outer and outer to inner, which is through, as you've just seen in the example of the till, through artifacts. Or artifact can mean anything from a spoon to a computer, or any handheld device, anything at all. These humanly created objects. And then I put another little arrow on the right. This is an activity. We do this through activity. It's an active, constant, interactive movement that's going on, and that is part of us transforming the world. And the arrow again is two directions, because we transform the world, but the world also transforms us. So this is the heading dynamic singularity, because the completely individual personality, which there cannot be any copies of, there can only be one individual, each one is completely unique, but within that you have a dynamic, which is that it has to exist in this infinite complex world of relations. So it's that contradiction, if you like, within the individual that constantly creates movement and change.
So, for example, if we think of the Wizard of Oz, you have the cowardly lion who is cowardly through most of the book, and a traditional reading, one that Ilyenkov, he doesn't talk about Wizard of Oz, but he criticizes it with respect to a Russian tragedy. A traditional, or even a kind of reductive Freudian reading would be that actually at the end, when the cowardly lion turns out to be a brave lion, the bravery was inside him all along, and then it was excavated from within him. So there's lots of psychoanalysis where the idea is you bring up these things that are in your unconscious and you've kind of been repressing them. Well, for Ilyenkov, the unconscious is not this thing in your brain. It's this network across people, environments. It's between all of us, and actually what allowed the cowardly lion to actually not be a cowardly lion, to discover that he was brave, is the activities of killing the witch and this kind of quest that he goes on with other characters. So partly what you've got is he finally feels like himself, and he recognizes as himself through the activity of killing the witch, but it's only in that activity. So suddenly he finds this resonance where he's like, now I finally feel like myself. But what that is a kind of power which is only relevant in a social context, in how he's being recognized by others, in the sense that others recognize his bravery, and it's not just two minds connecting. It's not just that they're like recognizing his bravery in their thoughts. They're recognizing his bravery because here it is. He really is acting brave. There isn't any kind of mind-to-mind connection needed here, and it is in these social relations. But what it ultimately means is that a personality, for Ilyenkov, is a kind of system of forces. It's what someone opens up for others. Now, there is this term in cognitive science of an affordance, so you could look at it as a landscape of affordances, but it's more than affordances, because it's not just that someone else allows me to see a world in a new way or to do things that I hadn't considered before. It's also obviously so much to do with our feelings and the value that the world has for us. So someone's personality isn't just changing how we relate to them, it's changing how we relate to the whole world. And when Ilyenkov talks about the power of personality, for me, this is how I interpret what he means by that.
Yeah, so this is our last slide. And I want to add to the previous thought as well, that this interaction between us and others through objects, through complex objects or simple objects, is what allows us to actually take into ourselves this complex, wide and differentiated landscape that exists outside of us. So we can actually, if you like, take that into ourselves. And there are moments within development which can bring about very dramatic transformations, not just change, but transformation. And these take place when there's something, for example, the example I've given is the Occupied movement, because it was people beginning to see themselves in a new way by what they experienced with others and through the eyes of others. And this image I've put here is actually taken from 2011 protests in Israel, where there was 400,000 people on the streets against the cost of living crisis, a rise in the cost of living, which we obviously have a new version of that, a more advanced version of that in today's world, with incredible rise in the cost of living and movements that have arisen to try to combat that. So reflecting on these changes and how they can bring about not just changes but leaps and transformational leaps of a personality through other people is quite is absolutely vital when you're trying to think about changing the world and bringing about massive serious social changes. And I just want to read here a quotation from it was a young woman in this protest in Israel, and which kind of expressed this change. She said, my generation grew up with a sense of being alone in the world. It's us facing the screen. The other is our enemy, which is our competitor. We grew up with a feeling that we live in a race which we could not win, where we could not lean upon anyone else. We were taught that it was either you or the other. That's capitalism, a competition that never ends. The fact that it was precisely this generation, the most solitary and withdrawn generation, that stood up and took action is nothing short of miraculous. The miracle of summer 2011. Thus, everything that we thought, everything that they taught us is not true. What happened here is precisely what needed to happen. I thought that was a good thing to think about, and perhaps you could suggest some examples of what today could change and encourage the power of personality. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Wow, that's amazing. So maybe people can put their questions on the chat and also raise their hands so we can have a discussion. Meanwhile, well, I don't see anybody. Oh, yeah, cool. So I wanted to ask my own question, but I think Daniel Morel was the first one.
Hi, yeah, I'm also going to have to go soon as well. So if I could just quickly get my question, that is appreciated. It strikes me that Ilyenkov's development of, not just in this essay, but in other works as well, of what ideas are and what consciousness is and personality is very useful for criticizing the current craze around AI and the notion that seems to be prevalent that sort of AI might be conscious because it's sort of very fast at processing things or because it's very clever. And it's there, that way of looking at it seems to me not unlike the example of chipping a bit of marble off of a statue and thinking that you can understand it, rather than seeing it as the relationship. So I just wondered what others thought about that, and if you have anything, if anybody else has basically thought about that, and if you have anything to add on how, yeah, it's not really a proper question, I suppose, but.
Yeah, sure. So I certainly agree that something like ChatGPT doesn't have access to what Ilyenkov calls the ideal, partly because things don't matter to the ChatGPT in the way that it matters to us in our relations, in the problems that we have in our worlds, and that makes things meaningful in a human way. Yeah, thanks.
Who's next? Well, I'll say something, Jen. Ilyenkov's essay gets more subtle when you get into it, because he gets into, shall we say, at least a little bit more of the specifics of how a personality is developed, like from an infant and newborn, that really, is a biological being with obviously a human brain and so forth, that, it's operating on such a simple elemental level that the personality as such is not formed. And, that the process by which this occurs on a concrete way is actually of importance. And I think one thing to add to significant is the fact that none of us, at least I don't, have memories of the first couple of years of our life. Maybe a couple scattered memories of the first 2-3 years, but whatever happened to you, unless somebody tells you and they're telling you the truth, you don't know exactly what happened. And that means that whatever, I'm not finished now, whatever, inherited tendencies you may have, whatever those might be, the way that those would come out in the first few years of your life would depend on what's happening in very personal interactions with the people that are taking care of you, for example. So trauma, injury of some kind, fear, or maybe the opposite, something that's the opposite of that. By the time you even know that you would have a formed personality, or even before you would know it, things are taking place that you will never know happen, probably. And, I generally did not spend a whole lot of time thinking about this, except in the past few years when I realized that there must have been something happened in the past few years of my life that I don't know, that has a lot to do with how I, what my basic orientation is. And so it does seem like it's inborn, but what we're really dealing with is certain things that happen, perhaps untraceable, that form something, that is an initial way of dealing with the outside world. And, that can change. But one of the things about the subtlety of this is that, the match between the internal self, however it comes about, and the external environment is a very idiosyncratic one. They don't always match up. And so there is, in small ways or large, some kind of negotiation between your habits of being who you are and dealing with the outside world. And I think looking more into that process is important. Ilyenkov has a start to that, but of course it's only a beginning in terms of what he describes in this essay. But one of the things that's useful about it, and which reminded me of what Kyrill said at the beginning about this woman he was having a disagreement with, is that if you look at existentialism, the problem is that it doesn't really go into the development of how this happens. It really is just an abstraction. And it doesn't go into how people get to be the way they are, which does have something to say with how certain productions, cultural productions, don't delve into the level of degradation that people are actually experiencing, how it came to be. And one of the things that's also interesting that Ilyenkov deals with in the essay is when he deals with people are developed to the point where they're reacting against very stereotyped ways of behavior that are imposed upon them. And I think that's also important because he does deal with this. The disharmony has to do with the mismatch between how you've developed and what's being imposed upon you. And I think that's very interesting, especially if you contrast it with certain types of existentialist works, which either reveal this or just turn into abstract.
I'm so sorry. Yeah, we can have a follow-up group and you can have your own presentation. I just this is a Q&A. So what was your question?
Well, I didn't have a question. I had an observation among many, but I'll stop now.
Okay, thank you so much. Maybe Corinna or Kyrill want to comment on observation.
No, I mean, that's all interesting. Thanks, Ralph.
Yeah, I'd add to that. Yeah, you're right, Ralph. There are discontinuities, but this is also this thing of leaps that, development of any individual is going to be, full of contradictions and there are interruptions and breaks and disasters and wonderful things. Ilyenkov's life is an example of that. The most wonderful philosopher and yet the most toughest, terrible things that took place in his life. And you're right. We don't know everything of our child. Can't possibly know all the things that shaped us. We're born into a world that we don't choose, and we don't know that much about it. But that's the whole point of investigation and trying to understand, and also the possibility of escaping from that?
Lars?
Oh, there's a question.
Yeah, well, I don't know if this is a question, but anyway, I'll ask you, you know, I'm very fond of something that Marx said in economic and philosophical manuscripts, where he said something that the individual is the social being. And that sort of settles the foundation, I think, for this discussion. You know, there is no individual without a social environment, and there is no social environment without individuals. So there's this dialectical here. And I was sort of wondering whether you think that this is the sort of basis that Ilyenkov used when he talked or considered or discussed personality.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the most practical answer to how do we kind of allow the kind of power that someone could have in terms of their personality to be produced is social situations. It is about kind of supporting the social experiences that we have. Yeah, it can't just be done like, I don't know, in a lab where they're training at the gym or something. Yeah.
So I have a question if nobody else, because I allow somebody else come before me. So I would like to return to the question about AI. That was the first one, and ask, so AI is obviously this alienation, and as Kyrill said, but then it's also clearly a human tool. So we created that, and we can make it different. But it's come to the what Corinna was saying in her presentation about tools and artifact. And it's come to the major question about what is art and what is the difference between like applied art and high art and all of that. So yeah, I actually don't know so much about Ilyenkov, but the first time I read Vygotsky, and that was my reason why it's like, you know, Ilyenkov and Vygotsky, oh my God, it was this psychology of art that I read when I was like 15 years old, and I was so fascinated by this. It was just like changed my personality. So if you can expand on what is the relationship between Ilyenkov and Vygotsky and his ideas of what is art and art as a tools, and then you know, artificial intelligence can come in.
It might be worth people, if everybody can see the chat, I don't know, but there's various very good points been made in the chat, including when this essay was written, which was the year of his passing, actually. And also Monica's made a point there, which is a very good one.
Yeah, on Nika's question, yeah, I agree that psychology of art is fascinating, and it's Vygotsky's PhD dissertation. It has lots of ideas where he's trying things out, and he says a work of art is the collectivization of affect, which is an interesting thing in the sense that, yeah, it's sort of, it relates lots of people to each other. So for Vygotsky, insofar as a work of art is a work of art, the thing that makes it a work of art is that it's relating people in certain effectively colored ways. So yeah, for Ilyenkov, he highlights all sorts of things in terms of this affectivity, that actually a work of art also structures our activity in interesting ways. What an aesthetic reaction is, it's quite similar to a social norm. So actually, it directs us in certain ways. So we can by sharing it as an object, we're both looking at it together, and we're kind of feeding in certain ways. It could coordinate us, or I guess the example I prefer is I often use this, the Van Gogh's Starry Night. When I talk to a class of teenagers about it, they first think that it's happy, that it's a happy painting, and then we talk about it for a while, and then they see that it's a sad painting. And this kind of transformation, it happens with lots of works of art. This happens if I teach Robert Frost's Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. What is this conversion? Well, it's a conversion where actually they develop the capacity to feel something new in interacting with the same object, and then if it's expanding their personality, then I, as an adult, I'm walking through, I'm on a hike, and then I suddenly feel like, oh wow, this is like stopping by woods on a snowy evening. So here's Robert Frost, who's kind of expanded the world for me through his power. So I'm kind of interested in how works of art can help us to do that, to recognize things in our own lives.
And
Yeah, this is a very good example. I mean, it's very important, this seeing the world through others' eyes, which is what an artist helps you to do. And the more, this can be double, this is sort of layers of enhancement and reflection that you don't only see it through one other person's eyes, you start to see it through many other people's eyes. And that's quite, can lead to extraordinary experiences, which come across as personal ones, and yet they are collective. There's a famous thing called the Stendhal syndrome, who was a French writer who, it was named after him, because the phenomena, if you see a work of art, you can faint. You actually have a physical fainting fit. And this is probably because you're seeing this thing that you realize so many other people have had incredible experiences in front of it, and that kind of enters your conscious subconscious and knocks you out. I think it shows the power of personality as intensified by more and more collective experience. And that's why I don't agree with Ralph. Events do change people, can change people fundamentally. They can change your personality. You're still the same person, but you look at things in a different way, and you start to do things differently as well. Okay, we've got a comment from Daniel now.
Okay, we have a more or less fully functioning symbolic register, but incomplete imaginary and non-existent, or perhaps mechanical real as such, literary reality, and can do some limited relation processing. We have none the invisible aspects of cognition, which are very difficult to observe, i.e. lacks sort of unconscious, and which lies beyond words. Well, okay, so yeah, well, there's some connections, some disconnections. This is Zizek's thesis, right? At the moment, AI doesn't have an unconscious. Well, so I argue that it's a symbolic that it doesn't have. I think so. Lacan's an interesting figure to compare. He is also interested in this Hegel that I highlighted, the master-slave stuff. He's kind of a lot of what he is doing is intentionally kind of sticking a spoke into Marxism to react against Marxism. The extent to which you think someone like Zizek and the Slovenian school is successful in recovering that, I don't think they are successful, but some people think they are. Yeah, so there is an early Lacan. There's a Lacan of the mirror stage, which is about this like moment of recognition, and that is something where you recognize yourself, and in a symbolic register, that there are kind of certain symbols that actually pick you out as the person that you are, and you attach yourself to all kind of labels, like I am a son or whatever. But actually, there's a type of work that's going on that's effective that AI is not doing. It's doing the kind of labeling of like identifying all of the things that are a son, say these kind of things that sons tend to say, like hi dad, or can I borrow some money? So therefore, yes, okay, it's all in the symbolic register, but it's missing the underlying kind of effective process, which is the reason for why sons say, can I have some money, please? But yeah, no, so Lacan's real is not something Ilyenkov would subscribe to at all. He doesn't think that there's an impasse between us and the world. So the whole thing is, Lacan says, we can't have this kind of connection with each other. There is no sexual relationship. Ilyenkov says there is no sexual relationship under capitalism. Actually, the reason why we have this mutual alienation where we can't actually directly relate to each other and share experiences is because of this kind of these kind of cybernetic systems that alienate us from each other. But he thinks, well, even within capitalism, we can share experiences. There are fully full experience which are collective where we orient to each other fully. But yeah, capitalism takes away, it estranges us. So yeah, it's not sustained. But anyway, yeah, something like that.
You know, if you try chatbot try to use it for philosophical ideas or questions or research, you really see its inadequacy fairly quickly. In fact, it's such a bullshitter. When it doesn't know the answer, it just makes up stuff. And then you have to call it on it and will admit it doesn't know what the hell it's talking about. That's a very interesting thing that I discovered. Also, I saw Starry Night in person and I broke down weeping. I had to go. But it wasn't because I was sad. It was because the emotional intensity of Van Gogh, which you cannot get on a reproduction in a book, is so extreme. It's so moving and intense. It's such intense beauty that sometimes it's too much for a person to take, you know, like going to the top of the mountain, you know, getting the tablets. So that was my reaction to Van Gogh. It never made me sad. It just made me overwhelmed. And I like that feeling because that's all I'm interested in. So if something doesn't move me, I don't want to be bothered. Now, as far as questions go, let me pose a question then, since that's what we're required to do. Well, I don't think Ilyenkov ultimately does this. Sometimes, like at the beginning of the essay, I get the feeling that he severs the biological constitution of the body from this other dimension of the formation of personality by social interaction. And it almost seems like, oh, well, this has nothing to do with the brain or anything else. Now, I don't think he ultimately commits himself to that, but you know, sometimes he kind of skirts that. And I wonder what other people have to say about that, how they feel about that.
While you're thinking about that one, I just should flag up that Ilyenkov did write a book called The Mystery of the Black Box, which was translated by Giuliano Vivaldi, and it's really about AI at that time that he was alive, which can be read, and we could share it. But my conclusion from that essay is that he basically it's not as complicated as people make it out, because the computer and computing and the AI development is a development of human tool making, and it's an instrument that human beings have developed. Therefore, it can go out of control, of course, like the atom bomb or anything else. But it's a humanly created thing, so it depends on us what it does. But just to add to that, I was reading about the top at I think MIT, the people who are working in AI are actually worried that computers don't have bodies because they don't have that, what kills the capacity for feeling, and that can potentially make them very dangerous if they don't have any human feeling or real understanding. Loris wants to speak. We've lost.
Yes,
Sorry, go on.
okay. About AI. in order for an AI system to be social, there must be some kind of communication between AI systems. There must be some kind of language that they both speak. If you consider this Marx principle, and that the individual is a social being, and corresponding to that would be that an AI would be a social being. And in order to be that, they must develop some kind of communication between them. And I also think that if you think that an AI system does not have that capability, then they can never have any ideal form as well, because ideal forms only emerge in social systems, in activity systems. So I don't think we have to be that afraid of AI as taking over the social, the humans right now, because they are simply not there at this moment. And then I think Ralph had a question about, or a comment about the biological aspect of personality, and I think sometimes that Ilyenkov is sort of neglecting the biological infrastructure and the dialectics between that kind of infrastructure and the social communal infrastructure. There must be something before we can act, something that enables action, and that differs then between what kind of community you're raised in. But still, you need to have some kind of biological infrastructure in order to act at all, and it seems like I got the impression that Ilyenkov is not neglecting that, but giving it less importance. But I think both are really important in order for an individual to develop a personality. Yeah, well, that's my comment.
So, yeah, I want to point out on time. So we're about an hour, but maybe at the end, probably it happens in the beginning, because many people here knows who's Ilyenkov, but many people in Museum of Care and online already just don't. So if it's possible for you just to come back and explain more on connection between Ilyenkov and Spinoza and Ilyenkov and Vygotsky, and just put it all in the context.
Sorry,
Could you say that again? I was getting a bit distracted by some of the chat. Could you say that again, Nick?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask to talk more about Ilyenkov for the people who don't know about him, but we know about Spinoza, Graeber, Marx, Hegel, Vygotsky.
what to contextualize that? Yeah, so he, as Corinna said, he drew a lot on Spinoza, Hegel, Marx, but Vygotsky came in actually a bit later, where people, when he started writing, pointed out to him that Vygotsky had been saying lots of the things that he's saying, and then he became very interested in Vygotsky, and he particularly became interested in contemporary educational approaches using Vygotsky's ideas. So he develops a deep interest and friendship with the staff and students of a school for deaf and blind children that was having lots of successes using Vygotsky methods. So he kind of, as a philosopher, was interested in all of these things in a climate where most of Soviet philosophy was just lifeless, as he called it. There was lots of just zombies all around him, reproducing the same old thing and doing something which is kind of basically saying the same thing in new ways, just saying stuff that's purely to do with language. So he wanted to do things like think, okay, how can we through philosophy help this blind child to learn? So that's one of the differences. The other differences is I think he's an interesting philosopher because at that time there wasn't anyone who actually created the philosophy, the point of which was to kind of challenge how things were, which is obviously kind of the whole point for Marxists. I think a philosophy that just kind of like passively observes things isn't that useful. What he wanted ultimately was to write in a way that's understandable to everyone, and also a philosophy that could potentially change things. He obviously felt a huge amount of animosity and didn't feel that ultimately. Yeah, I don't want to read into whatever reasons he had for taking his own life, but he was very unhappy with the way that the situation was. But whenever he could, while he was alive, to answer Mark's question, for example, he was trying to work out what are the general principles that all these kids who were often deaf and blind that allowed them to develop. And in some of the cases, he developed friendships with people who had sort of graduated from the school, but actually gone on to be very successful, to pass degrees, despite the kind of limitations that they had. And the point that was kind of made at that time, which I think is really important, is, well, every Marxist should be very interested in disability. Why isn't every Marxist actually talking about that as a central issue? Why do we have everything about value form, etc., but not about, look, if it's socialism, then what about actually thinking about what that society would look like? Not just like there's no wage relation, but what is it that someone who is disabled under socialism, like conversely, is disability something that someone has that's like a property within them, that's like in the core again, or can we challenge that and think about changing those conditions? So I think that's kind of like why he was particularly interested in this school.
Yeah, and that's absolutely so. And also, he turned to the Zagor school with his friend Meshchershikov, who was a very profound psychologist and did all these things that Kyrill just explained. But you could also say that because he was marginalized, his writings were often not, many of them were not published, and the ones that were published were heavily censored. And it's only in recent years that we've actually been able to get the texts of how he wrote things and his actual vision and his actual views on what was happening in the Soviet Union, which he was extremely critical of. And he didn't think that the Soviet Union was a real socialist society. He said it only had some of the bases for it, but it was still an extremely alienated society. He wrote about alienation. He wrote about, as existing in the Soviet Union. And his final years were anguished because he was not allowed to do what he wanted to do, and as a philosopher. And he wanted to change the education in the Soviet Union to make people into real, fully developed citizens of a developed state.
Goodbye, guys. I need to log off.
Yeah, you're right, Mark. He wanted the state to wither away. Yeah.
And can I ask you at the end to describe about this Friends of Ilyenkov? What is it? Where is it? How do you form it? What is it doing?
Well, it was formed in 2012, and we've been really having a very good development. We've had four symposia, international symposium, some of them in person, some of them online. They were all in person, actually, come to think of it. They were all in person. And we've had the support from one of the most outstanding Ilyenkov scholars in Russia, who's called Andrei Maidansky, who's actually editing and all of Ilyenkov's works and looking at, from the original archives, working with Ilyenkov's daughter. So that's been very extraordinarily wonderful to be able to do that. Yeah, and we're getting ready to commemorate the 100th anniversary next year, when Ilyenkov was born in February. And there's quite a lot of things going on. And Sasha, who's here, he's working on projects in Berlin, and we're working with Turkish organization called Marxism and Sciences as well, who also publish they're not just an academic, they're not an academic journal. They want to develop their journal as a project parallel in a way to Museum of Care, to be a revolutionary project. And the IFI is a very diverse group of people. They're not of any particular single political view. Some of them are more revolutionary, some of them are really mainly academic. So it's a very diverse group, and we try to accommodate the widest possible spectrum of interests. But the really amazing thing is how Ilyenkov's, the power of his philosophy is really that he can provide directions, new directions to go into deeper and deeper in 21st century. I mean, the fact that he studied AI actually in his own time, he was really right up to speed with what was going on then. And it's the concept of that Vygotsky developed, the concept of human beings developing through all kinds of tools, whether they're symbolic or physical tools, is it's a very rich, has enormous potential.
Wow, amazing. Maybe we should talk later, and we can create a common reading groups because David also has some articles like Monastic itself, for example, very much similar to what you say now. This one, yeah, was unpublished, but it's on the davidgraeber.org website. But it will be really amazing to create something collectively. So from September, should we maybe talk about that later?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nika.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so we put it all on David Graeber YouTube channel, Museum of Care, and then we sent chat and the link to you and to the mailing list of the Graeber Institute and Museum of Care.
That's great. And we can publish on our, we can put on our Facebook and send a message out. When you've done it, we can send a link to it on our list. And if anybody here would like to subscribe to the IFI mailing list, please do so. Just put your email into the chat.
Yeah, maybe you should put in the chat the link.
Yeah, sorry,
I can also put it on YouTube comment, as a YouTube comment. Yeah. Okay, thank you everybody for coming. That was exciting.
Just give me 1 second.
No, I'm not closing. I will definitely. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I hope it's a beginning, and we can make more and more collaborations and sessions. Yeah, very nice to meet everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very
It
much.
was beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark,
Thank you. Yeah.
for arranging all of that. Yeah.